The Midnight Express was not just any tour bus. It was a relic of the past, refurbished for modern travelers seeking a unique experience. With its sleek black exterior and glowing blue neon trim, it looked like something out of a sci-fi movie rather than a practical vehicle for a 24-hour cross-country trip. The journey it promised was equally unusual. A one-day trek through scenic back roads and forgotten towns, culminating in an undisclosed final destination. The only certainty provided to the passengers was the departure time, 11:59 p.m. sharp. At the terminal, the crowd waiting to board was as eclectic as the bus itself. Among them was a middle-aged couple, Philip and Clara, dressed like they were attending a 1920s gala. Then there was a lone traveler, Rachel, clutching a camera and a notebook, her eyes darting nervously. A young man, Tyler, slouched in a leather jacket, earbuds in, seemed uninterested in everything around him. A soft-spoken older man, Mr. Dawson, carried a briefcase and muttered prayers under his breath. And finally, two friends, Mia and Jason, bickered over snacks, oblivious to the solemn atmosphere. The Midnight Express drew strange individuals, and none of the passengers seemed to question why. The driver, a man dressed in a crisp, dark uniform, appeared moments before boarding. His face was partially obscured by the shadow of his cap, and his voice was deep and measured as he checked tickets. He moved mechanically, his movements almost too precise, as though every step was rehearsed. When Clara asked a question about the route, he paused for a moment too long before responding. Everything will be revealed in time. It wasn't reassuring, but the passengers exchanged awkward glances and chalked it up to eccentricity. As the passengers settled in, the bus interior revealed itself to be surprisingly luxurious. Plush seats in crimson velvet-faced, tinted windows that seemed to swallow the light from the terminal. The overhead lights emitted a soft, golden glow, creating an almost dreamlike ambience. At the back of the bus was a minibar, stocked with beverages that no one seemed ready to touch. A single digital clock above the driver's seat counted down to midnight, its blinking colon unnervingly loud in the silence. The engine roared to life, and the bus rolled onto the road precisely at 11:59 p.m. A faint cheer broke out among Mia and Jason, but the others remained subdued, watching as the terminal disappeared into the darkness. Outside, the scenery shifted quickly, from city lights to the muted grays of rural roads. The only sound was the low hum of the tires on the pavement, a rhythmic pulse that lulled some into uneasy silence. Rachel, the photographer, was the first to notice something odd. The stars outside seemed unusually bright, almost too perfect, like they were painted onto the night. She mentioned it to Tyler, who scoffed, but a glance at the other passengers revealed that they, too, had started noticing peculiarities. The road ahead stretched impossibly long, with no signs of intersections, other vehicles, or even landmarks. It felt as though the bus was traveling through a tunnel of eternal night. Conversation eventually began to fill the silence. Mr. Dawson shared that he was traveling to a family reunion, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly eager to arrive. Philip and Clara claimed they were celebrating their anniversary, but dodged questions about why they'd chosen such an unconventional trip. Rachel admitted she had signed up on a whim after finding a flyer in a coffee shop. When someone asked Tyler why he was there, he shrugged. Wanted to get away, was all he said. Hours passed, and the bus remained in motion. Yet the clock above the driver's seat seemed stuck at 3:33 a.m. Jason joked that it must be broken, but the unease among the passengers grew palpable. Mia whispered to Clara that she thought the driver hadn't moved once since the trip began. Clara dismissed it as paranoia, but others were less convinced. Eventually, the bus slowed and pulled into what looked like a rest stop. The driver stepped out without a word, leaving the passengers to their thoughts. Tyler took the opportunity to inspect the minibar, only to find the bottles labeled with names instead of beverages. Rachel, he muttered, holding up a bottle. His face paled when he saw his own name on another. The rest of the group gathered around, their curiosity quickly turning to dread. As the passengers exchanged theories about what they'd stumbled upon, a low, distorted hum filled the air, as if the bus itself was alive. The digital clock flickered before resetting to 11:59 p.m., and the driver re-entered, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "All aboard," he said, his voice carrying an edge of finality. None of the passengers dared to protest as the bus rolled back onto the endless, starless road. The Midnight Express continued its journey, gliding smoothly through the inky blackness of the countryside. Conversation among the passengers resumed, but this time it carried a heavier tone. The peculiarities they'd encountered, the mislabeled bottles, the timeless clock, the unnatural stars, lingered in their minds like an unspoken curse. Yet no one dared to address the elephant in the room. The question of why this bus, this trip, and this group had converged on this surreal journey. Rachel, ever the inquisitive one, decided to take matters in her own hands. "We've got a lot of time," she began, her voice quivering despite her best efforts to sound casual. "Why don't we get to know each other? Maybe figure out why we're all here?" Her suggestion was met with uneasy murmurs. No one wanted to admit it, but the idea seemed both logical and necessary, if only to fill the oppressive silence. Philip, the dapper man in the vintage suit, was the first to speak. "Clara and I," he said, gesturing to his wife, "are here to celebrate 30 wonderful years of marriage." His words were polished, but his eyes flickered with something that betrayed him. Anxiety, perhaps, or even deceit. Clara smiled faintly, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. When Jason pressed for details about how they met, Philip dodged the question, instead launching into a generic story about ballroom dancing and chance encounters. Next was Mr. Dawson, the elderly man with the briefcase. "I'm on my way to see my grandchildren," he said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Haven't seen them in years." "Not since." He trailed off, gripping the briefcase tighter. Mia asked gently what he carried inside, but he snapped back, "Nothing that concerns you." The abruptness of his tone shut down any further questions. Tyler, the lone young man with an air of indifference, rolled his eyes when it was his turn. "I told you I just wanted to get away. Away from my parents, away from my friends. Just away." His nonchalant facade cracked for a brief moment as he stared out the window, his reflection distorted against the impossible stars. Rachel hesitated before sharing her story. "I'm a photographer," she said, clutching her camera protectively. "I'm working on a project, capturing forgotten places, abandoned towns, that sort of thing. I found a flyer for this trip in an old diner. It seemed perfect." She paused, as though debating whether to say more. "But when I went back to the diner the next day, the flyer was gone. And so was the diner." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed her words. "So what? Are we supposed to believe this is some kind of ghost trip?" Jason scoffed, though his voice betrayed more nervousness than skepticism. "Look, we're all here because we bought tickets. That's it. No spooky diner nonsense." Mia nudged him, whispering for him to lower his voice. As if on cue, the bus shuddered, sending a jolt through the passengers. The lights flickered, plunging them into momentary darkness. When they came back on, the driver's voice crackled over the intercom. "Please remain seated," he said, his monotone voice echoing unnaturally. Unexpected turbulence, but the road ahead was smooth, and no wind rattled the windows. It was Clara who broke the silence. "I think we need to figure this out," she said, her voice trembling. "I mean, all of us here, it can't just be coincidence. Maybe there's something connecting us." Her suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. But before anyone could respond, the bus slowed and came to a stop. Outside, a faint orange glow illuminated what appeared to be a small roadside diner. Its sign, reading "Last Chance," flickered ominously in the darkness. The driver rose from his seat, turning to face the passengers for the first time. "Dinner break," he announced, his face obscured by the shadow of his cap. 30 minutes. No one moved. The stillness inside the bus felt like a prison, but the idea of stepping outside into the surreal, unknowable world beyond was equally terrifying. As Rachel's camera clicked softly, capturing the glowing sign, she whispered, "I think we were brought here for a reason, and I think we're about to find out what that reason is." The group hesitated at the driver's announcement, their collective unease weighing heavier than hunger. The diner, illuminated by its flickering last chance sign, stood as a lonely beacon in an otherwise desolate expanse. Its chrome facade gleamed under the unnatural glow of the orange light, and its windows revealed nothing but shadowy interiors. The bus door hissed open, and the driver's expectant stare pinned him in place. "We can't just stay here," Mia muttered, tugging at Jason's sleeve. "What if he's serious about the 30 minutes? Her friend shrugged non-committally, his bravado clearly faltering. One by one, the passengers rose reluctantly, their trepidation showing in every hesitant step. Outside, the air was strangely still. There was no breeze, no sound of wildlife, just the faint hum of the neon sign overhead. The ground beneath their feet felt oddly spongy, as though it wasn't entirely solid. Rachel trailed behind the group, her camera snapping pictures compulsively. "This place doesn't feel right," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the silence. Inside the diner, the atmosphere was no less strange. The decor was quintessentially 1950s. Checkered floors, red leather booths, and a jukebox glowing faintly in the corner. Yet everything seemed too pristine, as though it had been preserved in a time capsule. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, but no kitchen was visible, and no staff appeared to greet them. "Where's the cook?" Philip asked, his tone edged with nervousness. Clara squeezed his arm tightly, her eyes darting around the room. The group shuffled to a long counter lined with chrome stools, but no one dared to sit. A lone menu sat propped up at the end, written in blocky, handwritten letters. "Special. What you desire most." "What kind of menu is that?" Tyler scoffed, but his bravado felt hollow. Rachel leaned over to examine it, but before she could comment, the jukebox sprang to life with a static-laden rendition of an old jazz tune. The sudden noise made everyone jump, and Jason let out a nervous laugh. "This is ridiculous," he said, his voice too loud in the small space. Suddenly, a voice echoed from behind the counter. "Welcome." It was low, gravelly, and without clear origin. The group froze as a figure emerged from the shadows, a man in a crisp white apron, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as he placed plates on the counter. "Tonight's special is exactly what you're looking for," he said, though his lips barely moved. The plates before them were empty, yet each passenger found themselves inexplicably drawn to them. Rachel reached out first, her fingers trembling as they brushed the smooth surface. The moment she made contact, an image began to form, a photograph of a small, dilapidated house on a barren hill. Her breath caught in her throat. That's the house from my project," she stammered. Philip's plate revealed a gold pocket watch, its hands frozen at 7:07. Clara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "That's your father's watch," she whispered. Philip looked shaken but said nothing. One by one, the others began to see images or objects on their plates. A child's drawing for Mr. Dawson, a torn concert ticket for Mia, and a set of car keys for Tyler. "What is this?" Jason demanded, his voice rising. "Some kind of trick? How do you know these things about us?" The figure behind the counter didn't answer. Instead, it gestured toward the jukebox, which now played a hauntingly slow version of Dream, A Little Dream of Me. Before anyone could react, the diner's windows darkened as if a thick fog had rolled in, obscuring the outside world. The orange glow of the last chance sign vanished, plunging the room into dimness. The group's unease turned to panic as they realized the diner now felt disconnected from any reality they'd known. Rachel's voice broke through the chaos. "We need to leave," she said firmly, clutching her camera. "Whatever this place is, it's not what it seems. It's trying to trap us here." The others nodded, abandoning their plates as they bolted for the door. Outside, the bus waited as if nothing had happened. The driver stood at the entrance, his face expressionless. "Time's up," he said, ushering them inside. As the passengers stumbled back into their seats, none of them could shake the feeling that the diner had taken something intangible from them. As the bus pulled away, Rachel glanced out the window. The diner had vanished, leaving only the dark, empty road behind. The Midnight Express resumed its journey, leaving the ominous diner and its haunting impressions behind. Yet inside the bus, the passengers were far from at ease. Their earlier silence had deepened into something more oppressive, as though the air itself had thickened with an unseen tension. The hum of the engine and the rhythmic crunch of tires on the road were the only sounds, but even they seemed distorted, as if muffled by an unseen hand. Rachel sat near the window, her camera resting on her lap. She had replayed the photos she'd taken at the diner, but none of them made sense. The building wasn't in any of the images, only an empty stretch of road where it should have been. She snapped another picture of the bus interior, testing her equipment. The photo appeared normal, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her through the lens. Does anyone else feel off? Clara's voice broke the silence, trembling and fragile. She sat beside Philip, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I can't stop thinking about that pocket watch. It's been years since I've seen it, and yet there it was, exactly as I remember. Yeah, Jason replied, his tone unusually subdued. That concert ticket on my plate, it was from the first gig I ever went to. I lost it ages ago. But why was it there? How could they know? His usual bravado was replaced by unease, and he rubbed his hands together as if trying to dispel a chill. Mr. Dawson, seated in the back, spoke for the first time since leaving the diner. It's not just about knowing, he said, his voice low and strained. That place, it's like it pulled pieces of us. Things we've forgotten, things we buried. But it's not just showing us. It's using them. He stared down at his briefcase, his knuckles white from gripping it so tightly. The group exchanged wary glances, the weight of his words settling over them. Tyler, who had been quiet since the diner, suddenly stood up and paced the aisle. I'm not staying on this bus, he declared, his voice cracking slightly. This isn't normal. That driver, that diner, the way the stars look out there, it's all wrong. Sit down, Philip said sharply, his authoritative tone cutting through Tyler's panic. Running off into the middle of nowhere won't solve anything. But Tyler shook his head vehemently. No, you don't get it. I feel like I'm being watched. Not just by the driver or by you all, but by something else. Something out there. As if on cue, the bus lights flickered again, plunging the cabin into darkness for a moment before they sputtered back to life. The passengers gasped as a new detail emerged. The windows were no longer blackened. Instead, they revealed an eerie, barren landscape bathed in a pale, silver glow. The road was gone, replaced by what looked like endless stretches of ash and bone-white trees twisted into grotesque shapes. What the hell is this? Mia whispered, pressing herself against her seat. Jason leaned closer to the window, squinting at the strange terrain. We're not on any highway, he said, his voice flat with disbelief. This isn't even Earth. The driver's voice crackled over the intercom, cutting through their shock. Please remain seated. The journey is far from over. His tone was calm, almost robotic, but it carried an undercurrent of menace that sent chills through the group. Rachel's camera beeped, drawing everyone's attention. She had instinctively taken a picture of the landscape, but the image on her screen wasn't what she expected. Instead of barren trees and ash, the photo showed figures, vague, shadowy forms standing in the distance, their faces indistinct, but their presence undeniable. They're out there, Rachel said, her voice trembling as she passed the camera around. I don't know what they are, but they're waiting for us. The group recoiled at the sight, their fear growing more palpable with every second. Philip stood abruptly, his face pale but resolute. Enough of this. We need answers, and we're not going to get them sitting here. He marched to the front of the bus, ignoring Clara's pleas to stop, and banged on the door to the driver's compartment. Hey, who are you? Where are you taking us? The driver didn't respond, but the bus jerked violently, throwing Philip to the floor. The passengers screamed as the lights dimmed again, and for a brief moment, the figures Rachel had captured on her camera seemed to materialize outside the windows. They pressed their indistinct faces against the glass, their forms rippling like smoke. When the lights returned, the figures were gone, and the bus had returned to the dark, endless road. Philip groaned as Clara helped him back to his seat, his courage now replaced with the same fear gripping the rest of them. The group sat in tense silence, their breath shallow and their minds racing. Whatever this journey was, it was clear they were no longer in control. And as the Midnight Express hurtled toward an unknown destination, the passengers realized they could no longer trust the road ahead or the person driving them down it. The Midnight Express hurtled down its surreal, shifting road, and the tension in the cabin became unbearable. The eerie, barren landscape outside seemed alive in its stillness, every twisted tree and ash-dusted hill whispering secrets they couldn't hear. The passengers sat in frozen silence, their gazes fixed on anything but each other. The bus itself felt heavier, as though it had absorbed their collective dread. Clara broke the silence with a trembling voice. "We need to figure out what's happening," she said, her words more plea than statement. "This isn't just some dream or weird prank. It's real, and it's wrong." Jason nodded, his usual bravado entirely gone. "She's right. That diner wasn't normal. Neither is this bus. I don't think we're supposed to just sit here and let it take us wherever the hell we're going." Philip, still nursing the bruise from his earlier fall, gestured toward Rachel's camera. "Your pictures showed those things outside. Maybe they weren't random. Maybe there's something we're supposed to see or understand." Rachel hesitated, clutching her camera like a lifeline. "I don't know. It feels like this place twists things. Our memories, our fears. If I keep taking pictures, I'm scared of what I'll find." Before anyone could respond, the bus shuddered violently, throwing everyone against their seats. The overhead lights flickered once more, but this time, they didn't come back on. Panic erupted as the bus plunged into near-total darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moonlit landscape outside. Then came the voice. It was soft at first, a barely audible whisper that seemed to echo from every corner of the bus. "Where am I?" it asked, the words dragging like rusted nails across metal. The passengers froze, their eyes darting around the cabin. "Who said that?" Mia whispered, her voice cracking with fear. No one answered. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. "Where am I?" it repeated, each word laced with desperation. Rachel aimed her camera at the aisle and clicked. The flash illuminated the bus for a split second, and what she saw made her stomach lurch. A figure stood in the aisle, blurred, translucent, and undeniably human-shaped. It flickered like a faulty projection, its face distorted and shifting. "Where am I?" it asked again, louder this time, the voice reverberating painfully in their ears. The passengers screamed, scrambling to the edges of their seats. Jason grabbed a loose metal bar from the overhead luggage rack, brandishing it like a weapon. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice wavered. The figure didn't move, but its form grew more defined. It wore a shabby coat and a hat pulled low over its face. "I didn't want to get on," it said, its voice hollow and mournful. "But the driver said it was my only chance." "What do you mean?" Clara asked, her voice trembling but clear. "What chance? Who are you?" The figure turned its flickering head toward her. "I wanted to go home," it whispered. "But there's no way back now. Only forward." As it spoke, the bus lurched again, throwing the passengers into chaos. The lights flickered back on, and the figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Rachel's camera clicked again, capturing the empty aisle. "What the hell was that?" Tyler shouted, his voice breaking with panic. "I don't think it was a ghost," Mr. Dawson said, his face pale but composed. "It felt different, like it was stuck here, just like us. Maybe it's part of whatever this is." Rachel reviewed her photos, her hands trembling. The figure was in the image, clearer now than before. Its face was a blurry mix of anguish and resignation, as though it had been caught in some endless loop of despair. The passengers exchanged nervous glances, their fear deepened by the realization that they might not be alone on the bus, or even in control of their own fate. Whatever the Midnight Express was, it seemed to be gathering more than just its current passengers. The whisper echoed one last time, faint and fading. "You can't leave." The words hung in the air like a curse, and the passengers were left to wonder if the warning was meant for them, or for the figure who had spoken it. The Midnight Express rolled on, the road beneath it as alien as the fear clinging to the passengers inside. No one spoke for several minutes after the ghostly figure's disappearance. The only sounds were the muted rumble of the engine and the faint rustling of restless movements. Each passenger was lost in their thoughts, their gazes shifting nervously toward the driver's compartment at the front of the bus. Rachel's camera sat and used in her lap. She had decided against taking more photos for now, afraid of what her lens might capture. Her mind raced with questions. Who was that figure? Why had it warned them? And most pressing of all, what lay ahead on this bizarre journey? "I can't do this," Tyler muttered, breaking the silence. He stood abruptly, pacing the aisle with jerky, frantic movements. "We're just sitting here like sheep waiting for the slaughter. We need to stop the bus. Confront that driver. Something." "I agree," Jason said, though his voice betrayed his unease. He still clutched the makeshift weapon he'd grabbed earlier, his knuckles white around the metal bar. "We need answers. That thing said we can't leave." "Why? What's keeping us here?" Philip, still seated, raised a hand to calm the rising tension. "Before we rush in, let's think this through. We don't know what's behind that door. It could be more dangerous than whatever's out there. Dangerous or not, we can't stay in the dark," Clara countered, her tone firmer than before. "The driver's the only one who knows what's going on. We need to talk to him." The group exchanged uncertain glances, but the decision was clear. Philip volunteered to approach the driver, given his earlier attempt, though he didn't look thrilled about it. Jason followed closely behind, his makeshift weapon in hand. The others remained in their seats, tense and watchful. As Philip rapped on the driver's door, the bus jolted slightly, as if in warning. "Driver," Philip called out, his voice steady but firm. "We need to talk. Now." The door creaked open slowly, revealing the shadowed figure of the driver. He didn't step into the cabin, but his face, or rather, the lack of it, sent a wave of unease through the group. Where features should have been, there was only smooth, pale skin like an unfinished mannequin. The passengers recoiled at the sight. "You're not supposed to leave your seats," the driver said, his voice calm but cold, as if scolding unruly children. "Interfering with the journey could have consequences." "Consequences?" Jason snapped, gripping the metal bar tighter. "You mean like being stuck in this nightmare? What is this place? Why are we here?" The driver tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the question. "You boarded the bus," he said simply. "That is enough. That's not an answer." Philip barked, his frustration boiling over. "Where are you taking us? Why was there a ghost, or whatever that thing was, in the aisle?" The driver paused, as if considering whether to respond. When he finally spoke, his tone was colder than before. "This bus doesn't just travel roads. It travels choices, regrets, and the echoes of what might have been. The passenger you saw was trapped by his own hesitation. You would do well to avoid his fate." "What does that mean?" Clara demanded from her seat. "Are we supposed to atone for something? Fix our mistakes? What are you trying to tell us?" The driver's head snapped in her direction, though his featureless face remained unreadable. "This is not about atonement," he said, his voice rising slightly. "It is about understanding. Every mile you travel, every moment you endure, will bring you closer to the truth. But if you interfere with the journey, what happens if we interfere?" Jason interrupted, stepping closer. The driver's voice dropped to a chilling whisper. "You will learn that some paths are worse than the one you're on." With that, the door slammed shut, leaving the passengers shaken and more confused than before. Philip turned back to the group, his face pale. "He knows more than he's saying," he muttered. "But he's not going to help us." "What did he mean about choices and regrets?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "Are we being punished? Is this some kind of test?" "I don't know," Philip replied, sitting down heavily. "But one thing's for sure, we're not just passengers anymore. We're part of whatever this is." The bus groaned as it hit a bump in the road, and the windows darkened again, cutting off the view of the unsettling landscape outside. The passengers sat in uneasy silence, each of them grappling with the driver's cryptic warning. As the Midnight Express rolled on, one thought united them. They weren't just traveling to a destination. They were unraveling a mystery that could either set them free or doom them forever. The passengers' unease grew heavier with every passing moment, as if the bus itself were absorbing their fear and amplifying it. The driver's cryptic warning hung over them like a shroud, but no one dared speak of it. The air in the cabin felt thicker, the occasional creaks and groans of the Midnight Express sounding unnervingly like whispers in the dark. It was Rachel who broke the silence, her voice quiet but resolute. There has to be more to this bus. It's not just the driver. What about the luggage compartment? She gestured toward the metal doors beneath the overhead racks, her eyes flickering with a mix of fear and determination. Do you think there's something hidden there? Clara asked, leaning forward in her seat. Maybe, Rachel replied, or maybe it's just normal storage. But I can't shake the feeling that everything here is important. Everything means something. Jason stood, still clutching the metal bar. Let's check it out, he said, moving toward the nearest compartment. If there's anything useful, we'll find it. Philip joined him, and together they tried the latch on the first compartment. It didn't budge. Jason tugged harder, his frustration mounting. It's locked, he muttered. That can't be right, Mia said, standing cautiously. Why would the luggage compartments be locked? On a normal bus, anyone can. Stop assuming anything about this bus is normal, Jason snapped, his voice harsher than he intended. He slammed the bar against the latch in frustration, the sharp clang echoing through the cabin. As if in response, the bus shuddered violently. The lights flickered again, but this time they didn't fully stabilize. A faint red hue tinted the cabin, casting eerie shadows on the passengers' faces. Maybe don't hit things, Clara hissed, gripping her seat. Jason ignored her and turned his attention to the second compartment. If the driver's hiding something, I'm going to find out what it is. He pried at the latch, using the bar as leverage. This time, with a loud snap, the compartment door swung open. The group leaned forward in unison, their collective breaths held. Inside was a single object, a small black suitcase, unmarked and seemingly unremarkable. That's it? Tyler asked, his voice dripping with disappointment. All this drama for a suitcase? Open it, Rachel said, her voice trembling. It might explain something. Jason hesitated, then reached for the suitcase. As his fingers brushed the handle, the bus groaned loudly, as though it were alive and protesting. He ignored it, pulling the suitcase into the aisle and setting it down. The others crowded around, their curiosity outweighing their fear. The latch clicked open easily, and Jason lifted the lid. What they saw inside was not what they expected. It was filled with photographs, each one aged and faded. Faces stared back at them, some smiling, some solemn. The passengers flipped through the pictures, a growing sense of unease settling over them. The faces were familiar. This can't be real, Clara whispered, holding up a photograph. It was of her, much younger, sitting on her childhood porch with her sister. Her hands shook as she dropped it back into the suitcase. Mia pulled out another photo, her eyes widening. It showed her standing next to a hospital bed, a frail, elderly woman lying on it. Tears welled in her eyes. This was my grandmother. She passed away years ago. Every passenger found their own image in the suitcase, each tied to a memory they hadn't spoken of in years. Even Mr. Dawson, who had remained silent throughout much of the journey, picked up a picture of himself in military uniform, a stern-faced woman standing beside him. This bus knows us, Philip said finally, his voice low and grave. It's not just a coincidence. It knows who we are, what we've done, and what we've lost. Jason stared at a photo of himself as a teenager, standing in front of a wrecked car. His face was hollow in the image, his hands covered in cuts and blood. This can't be happening, he murmured. How could these pictures even exist here? Before anyone could answer, the bus lurched again, harder than before. The suitcase snapped shut on its own, and the lights in the cabin dimmed further. The driver's voice crackled through the intercom, cold and detached. You were warned not to interfere, he said. The journey is not yours to control. Now you must bear the consequences. The passengers barely had time to react before the bus began to pick up speed, the landscape outside blurring into a disorienting haze. The lights flickered wildly, and the groaning of the bus grew louder, almost deafening. "What's happening?" Mia screamed, clutching the seat in front of her. The intercom buzzed again, the driver's voice cutting through the chaos. "Every choice has a cost, and now you will pay yours." As the bus hurtled forward, the passengers felt a sickening shift, as though the ground itself had disappeared. The Midnight Express wasn't just moving along a road anymore. It was plunging into something far darker and more dangerous. The Midnight Express plunged deeper into the unknown, the windows now a blur of crimson streaks, as though the bus were traveling through a vein of some colossal creature. The passengers clung to their seats, fear-stricken as the vehicle shuddered and twisted unnaturally. Whatever path they were on, it was no longer bound by the rules of the physical world. As suddenly as the chaos began, it ceased. The bus came to a jarring halt, throwing several passengers forward in their seats. The crimson streaks outside the windows vanished, replaced by an endless black void. The oppressive silence was almost deafening. "What just happened?" Clara whispered, her voice barely audible. "We stopped," Jason muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the seat in front of him. "But where?" Philip stood cautiously, scanning the aisle. "Is everyone okay?" he asked, his voice trembling. Most of the passengers nodded, though their expressions betrayed their unease. Only Mr. Dawson remained eerily calm, staring out into the void as though searching for something. "I don't think we're on a road anymore," Mia said, her voice trembling. She pointed to the windows, where faint whispers seemed to emanate from the darkness beyond. It was as if the void itself were alive, murmuring secrets meant to remain unheard. Rachel hesitated, then pulled out her camera, her instincts as a photographer overriding her fear. She raised it to her eye and snapped a photo. The flash illuminated the cabin for a brief moment, but when she looked at the display screen, her heart dropped. The photograph showed the aisle not as it was, but as something else entirely, a warped, endless corridor filled with shadowy figures. They loomed over empty seats, their faces obscured by a darkness that seemed to seep into the image itself. "What is that?" Clara asked, leaning over to see the screen, her breath caught in her throat. "The aisle, it's changing," Rachel stammered, her voice rising with panic. "It's not just us here anymore." Philip moved to the center of the bus, his eyes scanning the aisle. At first, it looked normal, dimly lit and lined with rows of seats. But then he noticed it. The aisle seemed longer, stretching further back than the physical length of the bus. And at the very end, barely visible, stood a figure. "Who's that?" Philip asked, pointing. Everyone turned, and gasps filled the cabin as they saw it. A person-shaped silhouette standing at the far end of the impossibly extended aisle. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was enough to send chills down their spines. "Is it one of us?" Tyler asked hesitantly. "No," Rachel whispered. "It's something else." The silhouette began to shift, moving closer without walking, as though it were gliding along the floor. Its shape grew more distinct as it approached. What was once a vague shadow now took on features. A face that looked eerily familiar but wrong, twisted as though someone had pulled and stretched it like putty. "It's mimicking us," Mia said, her voice barely audible. "Look at its face. It's changing into us." Sure enough, as the figure moved, its face flickered between the passengers like a broken screen cycling through images. It would briefly take on the appearance of Rachel, then Tyler, then Clara, before distorting again into a blank, featureless visage. "We need to move," Jason said, gripping his metal bar tighter. "Whatever that thing is, it's not friendly. But move where?" Clara asked, panic creeping into her voice. "There's nowhere to go." As if in response, the bus groaned again, and the aisle began to change beneath their feet. The seats melted away like wax, leaving behind a narrow, endless corridor lined with doors. Each door was different, some ornate, others plain and industrial, but all of them pulsed faintly, as though alive. "What is this?" Philip murmured, his eyes darting between the doors. "It's like the bus is offering us a choice," Rachel said, her voice trembling. "But which one do we take?" Before anyone could answer, the shadowy figure reached the group, its shifting face locking onto Mia. She froze, her eyes wide with terror, as the figure raised a hand. It wasn't a hand at all, but a writhing mass of black tendrils that reached for her, wrapping around her arm. "Let me go!" Mia screamed, pulling back with all her strength. The tendrils tightened, and the figure's face took on her exact likeness, smiling grotesquely as it held her in place. Jason lunged forward, swinging the metal bar at the figure. The weapon passed through it harmlessly as though striking smoke. The tendrils released Mia, but the figure didn't retreat. Instead, it stood motionless, its face flickering through each passenger's image again. "It's testing us," Philip said, his voice shaking. "It's trying to see who we are, what we'll do. This is all part of the journey. We don't have time to figure it out," Jason growled, stepping back toward the group. "Pick a door. Any door. We can't stay here." The group hesitated, their eyes darting between the pulsing doors. Each one seemed to beckon them, promising either salvation or ruin. The shadowy figure remained where it was, watching them with an unnerving stillness. Finally, Philip reached for the nearest door, his hand trembling as he gripped the handle. "Whatever's behind here," he said, glancing back at the others, "it has to be better than staying here." He twisted the handle and pushed the door open. A blinding light spilled out, and the group had no choice but to follow, stepping into the unknown once again. Behind them, the figure's distorted smile lingered in the flickering shadows of the vanishing aisle. The light was blinding, washing over the group as they stepped through the door Philip had chosen. For a moment, it felt like stepping into nothingness, weightless, soundless, and utterly empty. But then, as the light dimmed, they found themselves standing in a space that defied all reason. The room wasn't a room at all, but a vast, impossible expanse of floating platforms suspended in a shimmering void. Each platform appeared different. Some were overgrown with lush vegetation, others littered with old furniture, and a few filled with objects that seemed to pulsate unnaturally. Above and below them, the void sparkled with fragmented images, like shattered glass reflecting moments in time. "What is this place?" Clara whispered, stepping cautiously onto the nearest platform. Beneath her feet, the surface shimmered, and an image flickered to life, an old photograph of a little girl holding hands with her mother. The scene shifted, showing the same girl standing alone by a gravestone. Clara gasped and stepped back, the image fading into the platform's surface. "It's memories," Rachel said, her voice trembling as she looked around. "This place is made of memories." Philip crouched on another platform, his hand hovering above an object, a tarnished locket. When he touched it, the air around him rippled, and a scene materialized in the void. It was a family dinner, warm and lively, with a younger Philip at the table. But the scene darkened abruptly, the laughter fading as an argument erupted. Philip's father slammed his fists on the table, and the memory dissolved into static. "This isn't random," Philip said, standing up. "It's showing us things we might not want to see." Tyler approached a platform covered in broken mirrors. Each shard reflected a different version of himself, some looking older, others younger, and some distorted beyond recognition. One shard showed him with blood on his hands, standing over a faceless figure. He turned away, his breath quickening. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice taut. "This place isn't safe." "But where do we go?" Mia asked, clutching her arms as though trying to shield herself from the oppressive atmosphere. Jason, ever the pragmatist, scanned the horizon. Far off in the distance, he spotted a faint glow, a door, hovering in the void like a beacon. "There," he said, pointing. "That has to be the way out." As they moved across the platforms, the memories grew darker, more intrusive. Rachel stepped onto a platform and froze as it revealed a hospital room. A younger Rachel sat beside a hospital bed, holding the hand of a frail man. She whispered something, but the memory was muted. The man's chest rose and fell once more before going still. Tears welled in her eyes as she stumbled off the platform. "It's digging into us," she said, her voice breaking. "This place knows everything." The group pressed on, their pace quickening as the memories grew more visceral. Mia screamed as a platform beneath her feet erupted into a scene of her childhood. Her father yelling, her mother crying, and her younger self hiding under a table. The images burned with intensity before fading back into the shimmering void. Philip reached the edge of a platform and looked down. Far below, he saw his own face staring back at him, but it was warped and twisted. The reflection mouthed words he couldn't hear, its eyes full of malice. He stepped back, his heart pounding. "It's not just showing us memories," he said. "It's twisting them, feeding on them." As they drew closer to the glowing door, the platforms began to shift, rearranging themselves. The void pulsed with a deep, resonant hum, and the air grew heavy. The door moved further away, as if the space itself were alive and trying to trap them. Jason took the lead, leaping from one unstable platform to the next. The others followed, each jump accompanied by flashes of distorted memories that clawed at their minds. Clara nearly fell when a platform crumbled beneath her, but Jason caught her arm just in time. Finally, they reached the glowing door. Philip grabbed the handle and hesitated, looking back at the others. Whatever's beyond this, it has to be better than staying here. The group nodded, their faces pale and weary. As Philip opened the door, the light engulfed them once again, pulling them into another unknown. The last thing they saw before the door closed behind them was the void, shifting and pulsing with the fragmented pieces of their lives, as if it were watching them leave with a sinister curiosity. When the light subsided, they found themselves in a narrow, dimly lit corridor. The air was damp, the walls slick with something that glistened in the faint light. A low, guttural sound echoed in the distance, sending shivers down their spines. "Where are we now?" Rachel asked, her voice barely a whisper. Philip didn't answer. He simply gripped the door handle behind him and pulled, only to find it locked. They were trapped once again, the corridor stretching endlessly before them, like the start of another nightmare. The narrow, dimly lit corridor stretched before them like a maze that offered no escape. As their footsteps echoed on the wet, slick floor, an eerie silence settled in around them. The low, guttural sound they had heard earlier became more pronounced as they moved deeper into the passage. It was as if the sound was reverberating from the walls themselves, a mournful, drawn-out wail that seemed to vibrate the very air they breathed. Philip took a cautious step forward, his breath shallow and uneven. The others followed, their faces pale and tense, unsure of what to expect next. They moved slowly, their shoes squeaking on the slick surface, each footfall amplified in the stillness. The walls seemed to press in on them, and for a moment, Clara had the irrational thought that they might be closing in, pushing them towards some unknown, unseen fate. "Do you hear that?" Jason's voice was barely a murmur, but it carried the weight of fear. The others nodded, though none of them could make sense of the strange noise. It was distant, almost as if it were coming from far beyond the corridor, but somehow it felt far too close. The sound shifted. Sometimes it was a low hum, sometimes a distant cry, but always unsettling, as if it were something trying to reach them, to call them deeper into the darkness. Tyler's face had turned a shade paler as he looked around, his hand on the wall for stability. "We need to keep moving," he muttered, though the conviction in his voice was lacking. "Whatever's making that sound, it's not something I want to meet." They walked in silence for a few minutes, the tension thick enough to cut through. The further they went, the colder the air became. It wasn't a sudden drop in temperature, but a gradual, creeping chill that seemed to seep into their bones. Every breath they took felt heavier, thicker, and it began to feel like the very corridor was alive, pulsing with the oppressive weight of something watching them. Rachel suddenly stopped, her hand gripping her chest. "Something's wrong. I can feel it." Her eyes darted around as if searching for something, though there was nothing but the slick walls and the faint light that flickered overhead. "What do you mean?" Clara asked, stepping toward her friend, her voice full of concern. Rachel didn't respond at first. Instead, she stared ahead, her eyes widening in shock. "The walls, they're moving." The others froze, turning to look, At first, it seemed like an illusion, the kind of trick the mind plays when you've been under stress for too long. But then they saw it. Slowly, ever so subtly, the walls were shifting. The slick surface of the corridor seemed to ripple, and the low hum they had been hearing intensified. It was as if the entire corridor was alive, breathing in sync with their steps, tightening its grip around them with every passing moment. Philip reached for the door behind him, but as he grabbed the handle again, it was no longer there. The door had vanished, leaving only a smooth, unbroken wall in its place. His heart began to race as he pulled at the empty space, but it was futile. They were trapped in the corridor, and there was no way out. "Great," Jason muttered, his voice tinged with frustration. "So now what? Are we just supposed to wander in here until we, what? Die?" Rachel stepped away from the others, her gaze fixed on the far end of the corridor. "I don't think we have a choice," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "We have to keep moving forward. There's something at the end of this place." "I know it." They all followed her gaze, their eyes narrowing in the dim light. Far down the corridor, they could just make out a faint glow, an ominous, sickly light that beckoned them forward. It felt wrong, but it also felt like the only direction they could take. There was no other way out. They had to press on. The sound grew louder as they walked, filling the space around them. It was no longer just a hum or a cry. It was voices, hundreds of voices, overlapping and indistinct. Whispers, murmurs, cries for help, and laughter all blended together into a chaotic cacophony that rattled their minds. It felt as if the corridor itself was alive with the memories of everyone who had ever been trapped here. As they reached the source of the light, they found themselves facing a door, old and battered, with strange symbols carved into its surface. The door seemed out of place in the endless hallway, as though it belonged to another world entirely. The air around it felt different, warmer, heavier, and behind the door, there was something waiting. They could feel it, could sense it deep in their bones. Philip stepped forward and placed his hand on the door. The moment his skin touched the cold metal, a surge of energy shot through him, and the voices in the corridor reached a deafening crescendo. His heart raced, his mind spinning as if the very fabric of reality were beginning to tear apart. He pulled back his hand, but the feeling lingered, like an echo vibrating through his chest. "We have to open it," Philip said, his voice strained. "Whatever's waiting for us on the other side, we need to face it. It's the only way out." The others nodded, their expressions grim. They didn't have much choice. With trembling hands, Philip gripped the door handle and twisted. The door creaked open, revealing only darkness beyond. But as they stepped inside, the world around them seemed to shift again, and the corridor dissolved into nothingness. They had stepped into the unknown, and this time, there would be no turning back. The door slammed shut behind them with a resounding crash, and the darkness enveloped them like a thick, suffocating blanket. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The oppressive silence that followed was unlike any silence they had encountered before. It wasn't just the absence of sound. It felt as though the silence itself was a presence, something that weighed down on them, held them in place. They could not see each other in the darkness, but they could feel each other's presence, hear their shallow breaths, their anxious rustling. They weren't sure what had happened. One moment, they had been standing at the threshold of the door, with the faint, sickly light from the corridor just behind them. Now they were in a void, an abyss where time and space seemed to have no meaning. Philip stretched out his hand in front of him, trying to make out any contours or shapes, but all he felt was an unnatural cold smoothness. He could not even tell if he was standing on solid ground or if the space beneath him was merely a void. "Is anyone else here?" Rachel's voice trembled, barely more than a whisper. "I can't see anything. I can't hear anything except for us." Tyler let out a deep breath, his voice gruff as he responded. "I'm here. I'm here with you." His words seemed to float away into the void, swallowed by the silence before they could reach anyone else. Clara had begun to shake, her hands trembling as she reached out to find something to anchor herself to. She couldn't bring herself to speak, unsure of whether the others could even hear her. The fear in the air was palpable, clinging to their skin, sinking into their very beings. What was this place? Where were they? It was Philip who broke the silence, his voice shaking as he tried to make sense of it all. We got to keep moving. There has to be something here, something that will make sense of all this. He was talking more to himself than anyone else, but it seemed to rally the group. The fear had gripped them tightly, but they couldn't let it paralyze them. If there was any chance of escape, they would have to find it. I don't like this. I don't like this at all, Rachel muttered, her voice breaking the stillness. What if we're trapped forever? What if this is it? What if? Stop. Jason cut her off, his tone harsher than intended. We can't afford to fall apart now. Just keep moving. We'll figure this out. He wasn't sure whether he was reassuring Rachel or himself, but he knew they needed to focus. If they allowed fear to control them, they'd never make it out of here. They began to move cautiously, each of them groping blindly for something, anything to help orient them. The air was thick with a faint metallic scent, and the temperature had dropped even further, the chill biting into their skin. It felt as though the very air around them was alive, pressing in on them from all sides. Each footstep they took seemed to echo back at them, but not in the usual way. This was a deeper, more unsettling sound, a hollow reverberation that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Philip felt a chill run through his body as they continued forward, each step more uncertain than the last. The further they ventured, the more the feeling of disorientation grew. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly. How long had they been walking? Minutes? Hours? The very concept of time had become fluid, distorted. It felt as though they had been wandering for days. Yet there was no way to measure the passage of time in the black void around them. Suddenly, they all stopped, each person frozen in place. A faint sound, a scraping, a scuttling, echoed in the distance. It was a sound that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand on end. It was something alive, something moving in the dark, but they could not see it. They couldn't even pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. "What is that?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her eyes wide in terror. She felt a knot of dread tighten in her chest as the sound grew louder, drawing closer with each passing second. It was as though something was moving toward them, something hungry, something predatory. Tyler's eyes darted around, his heart hammering in his chest. "I don't know, but I don't want to find out." His breath hitched as the sound seemed to grow closer still, its pace quickening, as if whatever it was had detected them and was now closing in. They had to move. Philip turned, his eyes searching the void. The air around them felt thick, almost suffocating, as if something was watching them from the shadows. He could feel the hairs on his arms standing on end, the pulse of panic starting to rise within him. They had to find something, a way out, a sign, anything. "Everyone stay close," he said, though the words fell hollow as soon as they left his lips. It was as if the darkness itself had swallowed his words, leaving nothing but emptiness in its wake. But he knew they had no choice but to move forward. Whatever the sound was, they couldn't afford to wait and find out what it was. As they stumbled forward, disoriented and terrified, they heard the scuttling again, this time much closer. Philip's heart raced. The walls around them began to vibrate, the very space shaking under the weight of the unseen presence. This was no longer just a feeling. It was real, something they couldn't ignore. Whatever was in the dark with them was moving, and it was closing in fast. As panic set in, Philip's instinct screamed for them to run. But where could they run to? The labyrinth of darkness stretched on endlessly before them, and every direction felt just as hopeless as the last. The sound was everywhere now, and then, without warning, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, more unnerving than the noise had ever been. "Is it gone?" Rachel whispered, her voice trembling as she looked into the impenetrable darkness around them. No one had the answer, but they all knew one thing for sure. They were not alone. Something was in the dark with them, and it was waiting. The silence that followed the scuttling was maddening. It hung over them like a fog, thick and oppressive, making it hard to breathe. They could feel it pressing in on them, the weight of it suffocating their thoughts. The air felt colder still, as though something had changed. The very temperature around them seemed to drop, as if the darkness itself had absorbed all warmth from their surroundings. They continued to move, but the unease in their chests made every step heavier than the last. They had been walking for what felt like hours, but the more they moved, the less certain they became of where they were going. The darkness had swallowed every trace of direction, and each new step felt like they were walking in circles. The scuttling sound had stopped, but the tension remained. The feeling of being watched was inescapable, gnawing at their minds as if some invisible presence hovered just beyond their reach. The uncertainty of it all, the confusion, the isolation, was starting to gnaw at their resolve. Rachel, who had been walking just behind Philip, finally broke the silence. Her voice, barely above a whisper, quivered as she spoke. "Do you think we're the only ones left? What if we're not even on a bus anymore? What if this is something else entirely?" Her words hung in the air like a question they all dreaded to answer. Could they even trust their memories anymore? Had they somehow crossed into another world, one where time had no meaning, and they were just lost souls wandering its endless, dark halls? Tyler's hand shot out, grabbing Rachel's arm. "Don't," he hissed, "don't say that. We need to stay focused." His words were harsh, but his voice trembled beneath the surface. He wasn't sure if he was trying to reassure Rachel or himself. The fear that had taken root in his chest was only growing stronger with each passing second. The sound had stopped, but it wasn't the silence that unnerved him now. It was what had come after the silence, the feeling of something else, something unknown, that was still very much there with them. "I don't know what's happening," Jason said suddenly, his voice low, as if afraid to disturb the oppressive air around them. "But we have to keep moving. There's got to be a way out." His words seemed to ignite something in them all, a spark of desperate hope that had been nearly extinguished by the darkness around them. They couldn't afford to sit idle and wait for whatever was out there to find them. They had to keep pushing forward, even if they didn't know where forward led. For what felt like an eternity, they continued to walk through the oppressive dark. The air became thicker, heavier with each step, as though it was becoming harder to move through it. Their footsteps echoed back to them, unnaturally loud in the dead silence. There was no longer any sense of time, only an endless expanse of nothingness. It was as if the world had ceased to exist outside of the space they occupied, and the only reality was the suffocating, ever-present darkness. Then, without warning, the ground beneath them shifted. It was subtle at first, an almost imperceptible tremor, but it was enough to make their hearts race. They stopped, every muscle tensed in an instant. The sensation grew, the ground quaking beneath their feet. A low, guttural growl rumbled in the distance, deep and resonant, like some ancient creature awakening from slumber. The vibrations were coming from below them, from the very earth they stood on. "What the hell was that?" Clara gasped, clutching the sleeve of Tyler's jacket in a white-knuckled grip. Her eyes darted nervously, looking for any sign of movement in the dark. She could feel her pulse thudding in her throat, the thrum of fear reverberating through her body. Her heart pounded louder than the growl, louder than the tremors in the ground. Jason, his face pale and sweat beading on his forehead, shook his head. "I don't know, but whatever it is, we can't stay here." His voice was hoarse, as if the weight of the air itself was choking him. He began to move forward, his footsteps slow and tentative, as if waiting for the ground to give way beneath him at any moment. They followed him, the silence pressing in tighter as they walked, but the feeling of something lurking in the dark was inescapable. And then they saw it, just at the edge of their sight, a flicker, a shape that didn't belong. It was a shadow, an unnatural distortion of the dark, moving and shifting as if it had a life of its own. It was barely more than a whisper in their vision, a silhouette against the endless void. Philip froze, his breath catching in his throat. He had seen it too. "Did you see that?" he whispered, but the words felt meaningless, swallowed by the blackness around them. "It's just a trick of the light," Rachel said, but her voice was shaking, and there was no conviction in her words. The shape was still there, lurking at the corner of their vision, never fully revealing itself, but always present, always waiting. Then the shape moved. It slithered across the floor, like something crawling from the depths of the earth. It was close now, impossibly close. And as it drew near, they could hear the low, clicking sound that echoed in the stillness. It was like 1,000 tiny claws scraping against stone, each sound sending a jolt of fear through their bodies. Before they could react, the shape lunged forward, its form twisting and distorting in the darkness. The air shifted, the ground seemed to open beneath them, and the world, as they knew it, cracked open. There was a moment of blinding terror, a rush of cold that filled their lungs. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shape was gone. The sound stopped. The trembling earth ceased. They stood there, in the wake of the unsettling silence, hearts still racing, the taste of fear sharp in their mouths. It was as though the very world around them had taken a deep breath and held it, waiting for them to make the next move. But the darkness remained, and so did the feeling, an ancient, almost suffocating awareness that something else was out there, something far worse than they had yet encountered, something that was not bound by the same rules they were, something that had waited for them to wander too far into the void, something that now knew they were there and would never let them leave. The moment the shape vanished into the dark, a sudden tension took over the group. They stood frozen, not daring to move. The silence that followed was heavier than the one that preceded it, as if something had changed, something that they couldn't quite grasp yet. The unsettling presence that hung in the air remained, clinging to their every breath, making it harder to think clearly. Whatever was out there, it was still very much aware of them. For a long moment, no one spoke. Every sound they made seemed too loud, too intrusive in the midst of the suffocating stillness. Each footstep felt like an invitation for something terrible to happen. The darkness seemed to stretch out further, more oppressive now than ever before, as if it were closing in on them. They weren't just lost in some forgotten place. They were being hunted. Jason finally broke the silence, though his voice was strained and uncertain. "We can't stay here. Whatever that was, it's not gone." His words lingered in the air, the weight of them seeming to sink in slowly. The group had been walking aimlessly for what felt like an eternity, each step leading them deeper into a place where nothing made sense. The paths, the surroundings, the very fabric of reality around them had all started to dissolve. They were no longer on a bus, no longer in a world they recognized. They were somewhere else, somewhere detached from the rules they once understood. "Where do we go?" Rachel asked, her voice barely more than a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might provoke something in the dark. "We don't even know what's out there anymore." Her hands trembled, and her gaze kept darting to every corner, as if expecting something to lunge at her from the shadows. Tyler, whose anxiety had been building with each passing minute, stepped forward, his eyes wide and frantic. "We can't keep walking aimlessly," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and desperation. "We need to find something, anything that can give us a clue about where we are, about how to get out." But just as he spoke, the ground trembled once again. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, like the faintest vibration beneath their feet. But it quickly grew stronger, the earth rumbling beneath them as if some massive, unseen force was stirring below. The tremor spread through the group, a ripple of fear that passed from one person to the next. Something was coming, something big. "We have to go now," Philip said, his voice low and urgent. "We don't have a choice." They started moving again, but it was as if the very path itself was shifting beneath them. The space around them no longer felt stable, and the ground they walked on seemed to undulate like a living thing. The walls, if they could even be called walls anymore, seemed to bend and warp, the shadows growing longer, more twisted with each step they took. The tunnel they walked through felt like it was collapsing in on them, its dimensions constantly changing, warping, making it impossible to know where they were or where they were going. The sense of displacement grew worse as the minutes passed. The air itself felt thick and heavy, suffused with a strange electric charge. They were no longer moving through a linear space. They were floating through a liminal space that seemed to defy all logic. Every time they thought they reached a corner or the end of a hall, the walls simply shifted and changed, and they found themselves somewhere else entirely. The sense of direction had completely disappeared. Rachel's breath hitched in her throat. "This isn't real," she murmured, more to herself than anyone else. "This can't be real." But the words held no power. The reality they had known had long since evaporated, replaced by this strange, warped version of the world they once understood. And yet, despite everything, they kept moving forward. They had no other choice. The dark that surrounded them was too oppressive, too suffocating to let them linger in it. The fear of the unknown pushed them onward, even though they didn't know where they were headed. Every step they took felt like a gamble, a desperate attempt to escape the feeling that they were being pulled deeper into the belly of a nightmare. Then a sound, a creaking, grinding noise, broke through the tense silence, causing them all to stop in their tracks. It was followed by a soft scraping, like metal against stone, growing louder and louder. They looked around, but the darkness was impenetrable. It seemed to come from every direction, impossible to pinpoint. The noise was getting closer, and with it, a new, creeping terror. "What is that?" Tyler asked, his voice a panicked whisper. His eyes darted around, searching for any sign of what was coming. Jason, his face drawn with fear, grabbed Tyler's arm. "I don't know, but I don't think we should wait to find out." And then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence returned. But it was even more unsettling now, as if something had been lurking in the shadows, waiting for them to hear it. They continued forward, more cautiously now, every footstep heavy with the knowledge that the world they were moving through was no longer under their control. The path once again shifted. It twisted in ways that didn't make sense, but they had no choice but to follow it. The walls, or whatever they were, seemed to move with them. They weren't in a place that obeyed the rules of nature anymore. There was no up or down, no right or left. There was only the unknown, stretching out endlessly before them, with nothing to hold on to except the fear that gnawed at their minds. In the midst of it all, there was a moment when everything seemed to pause. The tremors stopped. The noise ceased. The world held its breath, waiting. And then, from somewhere in the shadows, a voice whispered, soft and chilling. "You'll never leave." The words echoed in their minds, reverberating through the dark like a curse, sending waves of terror through their bodies. For the first time since they had entered this place, they felt the full weight of their situation. The walls were closing in, the dark was watching them, and they were no longer just lost, they were trapped. The oppressive silence that followed the whisper felt like a physical weight, pressing against their chests. Each breath they took seemed louder than the last, filling the void with a sound that felt like an intrusion. The walls around them were no longer just walls. They were barriers suffocating them, confining them to an unknown, ever-shifting space. The uncertainty of their situation had morphed into something darker, more sinister, as if the very reality they knew was beginning to fray at the edges. Jason's heart raced as the words echoed in his mind, but the fear was starting to crystallize into something else. Anger. "We can't just stand here," he said, his voice hoarse, struggling to break free of the terror. "We have to find a way out, or we'll die here." His words hung in the air, as if they carried some weight of finality. No one responded immediately, and Jason turned to look at the others. They were all standing frozen, eyes wide, mouths slightly agape, as if they had been caught in a trance. Rachel was the first to break the silence. Her eyes flicked around nervously, and her voice trembled as she spoke. "But where do we go? We don't even know what's real anymore." She was right. There was no sense of direction, no way to tell which way led to safety, or if safety even existed in this place. They had no map, no guide, only the chilling feeling that whatever was watching them, whatever was manipulating their reality, had all the power. Tyler clenched his fists, frustration seeping into his tone. "We can't let it win. We've been trapped in here for too long. There has to be a way out." He stepped forward, his footfall echoing through the corridor, a stark reminder that they were still moving through a space that refused to remain stable. The walls, if they could even be called walls, continued to pulse with a strange, unholy rhythm. as if the space itself was alive, breathing. Philip had been silent up until this point, his face pale with the strain of the past few hours. He took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. Maybe we're not supposed to leave. His words were quiet, almost inaudible, but they seemed to cut through the tension like a knife. The group turned to look at him, confusion and disbelief spreading across their faces. Philip continued, his voice shaky but resolute. Maybe this place is where we're meant to be. Jason shook his head. No, you can't believe that. We didn't get on that bus just to end up here. There's a reason we're here, and it's not by accident. His tone was sharper now, the frustration building in his chest. We need to keep moving. We need to find something that makes sense. But as they continued down the path, the oppressive weight of the place grew heavier. Every step they took seemed to pull them deeper into the chaos, and every turn only led them further away from the world they knew. The corridor around them, once a vague structure of walls and passageways, had now taken on a more unnatural quality. The colors, the lighting, or the lack of it seemed to bleed into one another, merging into something strange and surreal. Time had stopped making sense. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. No one knew. As they walked, the air around them began to thicken. It wasn't just the darkness closing in. It was the space itself becoming more distorted. The walls weren't just warped anymore. They seemed to ripple, as if they were trying to contain something that wanted to break free. The very fabric of reality was coming undone. And it was in this disorienting, ever-changing landscape that something strange began to happen. Tyler stopped suddenly, his hand gripping Rachel's arm, his eyes wide with shock. "Do you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would disturb something even worse. The others paused, straining to listen. The sound was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like a distant hum, a vibration that seemed to pulse through the very air they breathed. And then, as if to answer his question, a loud, metallic screech shattered the silence. It came from the walls, from deep within the very structure of the space. The sound reverberated through the entire area, rattling their bones, as if the space itself was screaming in agony. The walls around them began to tremble violently, and the ground beneath their feet shook with a force that sent them stumbling. The floor seemed to dip and shift, as if they were standing on the edge of a cliff, with no clear way to climb back to safety. Philip stumbled backward, his hands outstretched in an instinctual attempt to steady himself. But there was no solid ground beneath him to grab. "We need to get out," he shouted, panic rising in his voice. But there was no escape. The path that had seemed to stretch endlessly before them had now turned into a labyrinth of shifting, writhing passageways. The walls bent at impossible angles, closing in on them from all sides, as if the very space itself was folding around them. It was no longer just a physical environment. It had become a living, breathing entity, and it was closing in. Jason's mind raced as the reality around them continued to dissolve. They had been moving through this place for what felt like an eternity, and now there was no clear escape. Every direction led them deeper into the abyss. The walls were alive, and they were no longer in control. The terror they had felt before was nothing compared to the dread that gripped their hearts now. The realization was inescapable. They weren't just trapped in this place. They were part of it. And it was only a matter of time before it consumed them completely. As the tremors of the shifting corridor faded, an unsettling calm descended upon the group. The walls, once pulsating with life, now stood still, their unnatural movements ceasing as abruptly as they had begun. For a brief moment, the air seemed to hold its breath, as if the space itself was waiting for them to make the next move. But the silence was not comforting. It was oppressive, suffocating, and they all knew that whatever they had just experienced was only the beginning. Jason's heart pounded in his chest as he looked around, trying to make sense of their surroundings. The hallways, if they could even be called that anymore, stretched out before them in a seemingly endless maze. There was no distinguishing feature, nothing to indicate where they had come from or where they were supposed to go. The walls were smooth, featureless, as if they had been stripped of any recognizable pattern. It was as though they had stepped into a world that existed outside of time and space, where logic no longer applied. Rachel, her face pale and drawn, was the first to speak. "This isn't real," she muttered almost to herself. "None of this is real. It can't be." Her voice quivered, betraying her attempt to hold on to some shred of sanity. The others nodded in agreement, but no one spoke. What was there to say? How could they rationalize what had happened? The very air around them felt charged, as though the laws of reality had been suspended, leaving them trapped in an impossible world. Tyler, ever the optimist, tried to break the tension. "We can't just give up," he said, his voice steady despite the uncertainty. "There has to be a way out of here. We just need to keep moving forward. We can't let it win." His words were meant to inspire courage, but they fell flat in the face of their collective dread. The walls loomed around them like silent sentinels, and every step they took felt as though they were sinking deeper into the unknown. Philip, who had been unusually quiet, finally spoke, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "What if we're not meant to leave?" His question hung in the air, more a statement than a query. He had been grappling with the idea for a while now, the thought that perhaps they weren't supposed to escape this place, that maybe this was their fate. It was a thought that gnawed at him, a fear that had started to take root in his mind. Maybe they weren't the ones in control. Maybe they had never been. Jason turned to him sharply, frustration boiling over. "What are you talking about? We can't just accept this. We got to find a way out. There's always a way out." He was desperate, clinging to the hope that they weren't truly trapped in some twisted dimension, that their lives hadn't come to this horrifying, incomprehensible end. But deep down, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was very, very wrong. This place was changing them, bending their thoughts, twisting their desires. Rachel suddenly gasped, stepping back. "Look," she cried, pointing down the hall. The others turned in unison, their eyes narrowing as they tried to focus on the distant figure she had spotted. It was a shadow, moving swiftly and deliberately along the corridor. For a moment, it seemed like an illusion, a trick of the mind. But as it came closer, the figure took on a more distinct shape. It was a person, or at least it appeared to be. The group held their collective breath as the figure grew nearer, and for a fleeting moment, they thought it might be someone who could help them, someone who had found their way out. But as the figure approached, it became clear that this was no savior. The face was obscured by a hood, the body draped in tattered clothing. The person moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, as though their limbs were not their own. "Stay back," Jason warned, stepping forward instinctively, his heart racing. He didn't know why, but something about the figure didn't sit right with him. It was like a presence that didn't belong in this world, like a manifestation of something far darker than they could comprehend. The figure halted in front of them, and for a moment, there was silence. The air grew thick with tension, as if everything around them had paused, waiting for the next move. And then, in a voice that was both familiar and foreign, the figure spoke. "You're not going to like what happens next," it said, its voice carrying a sense of finality that sent a chill down their spines. For a heartbeat, no one moved. They were paralyzed, caught between the desire to flee and the need to understand. But before they could react, the figure stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. With a sudden, violent motion, it raised its hand and pointed toward the far end of the hall. "You've been trying to escape," it said, its voice now growing colder, more distorted. "But there's no escape. Not for you. Not for any of you." The words sent a shiver through Jason's body, and his breath caught in his throat. The figure's eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to pierce through him, and for a moment, he saw flashes of images, fragments of memories, moments that felt like they belonged to someone else. The feeling was overwhelming, like he was seeing into another world, one where the rules of reality no longer applied. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving the group standing in stunned silence. The air was still, but now it was heavier, more oppressive than before. The walls seemed to close in around them, as if the space itself was responding to the warning they had just received. "What does that mean?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. Jason shook his head, his mind spinning with the implications of what had just happened. "I don't know," he muttered, his voice hollow. "But I'm starting to think we've made a huge mistake by coming here." In that moment, it became painfully clear. The reality they had once known was gone. Whatever this place was, whatever rules it followed, they were no longer part of the world they had left behind. The illusion of escape had been shattered. They weren't just trapped. They were being tested, manipulated, and there was no guarantee they would survive whatever came next. The group stood frozen in place, their minds racing with the words of the strange figure. "There's no escape," it had said. The words echoed in Jason's mind, growing louder with every passing second. What did it mean? Had they really been trying to escape? Or had they been drawn into something far greater, something they were never meant to understand? The entire concept of escape now felt like a distant illusion, a far-off fantasy that no longer made sense in the warped reality they found themselves in. There was no going back, and perhaps there never had been. They had crossed a threshold, but the true nature of that crossing had yet to be revealed. Tyler was the first to break the silence, his voice thick with disbelief. "What just happened? Who was that? And what the hell did it mean by, 'there's no escape'?" His words felt like an attempt to ground himself, as if he could somehow break free from the strange, suffocating atmosphere that had begun to press down on them all. But even as he spoke, there was a certain edge to his voice, a thin veneer of panic he was trying desperately to mask. Rachel shuddered. "I don't know what that thing was, but I don't think it was human. And it knew things it shouldn't have known." Her eyes darted around nervously, searching for something to latch onto, but all she saw were the featureless walls of the corridor. There was nothing to reassure them. They were alone, isolated in a place that twisted their perceptions and made every movement feel like a futile attempt to break free. Jason tried to steady his breathing. "We need to keep moving. Whatever that was, it's gone now." He didn't know if he believed his own words. In truth, they were all trapped in a place where even their thoughts were no longer their own. The more they spoke about their situation, the more they realized how little they understood. It was as if they had crossed some threshold, stepped into a world where the rules of time and space were no longer applicable, and now the very act of trying to make sense of it was an exercise in futility. But despite the overwhelming sense of dread, the desire to keep moving was too strong. Maybe there was still a chance, a way to outrun whatever it was that haunted them. Or perhaps it was just the instinctive need to act, to do something, anything, to break free from the paralysis of fear that threatened to consume them. The group moved forward, their steps slow and measured, as if they were trying to avoid disturbing the fragile calm that had settled after the figure's cryptic warning. But the tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Every hallway seemed to lead to another, and every corner they turned brought them no closer to an answer. The walls, once cold and smooth, now seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance, shifting imperceptibly with each step they took. Time itself felt distorted, as though they were moving through a place where hours could pass in the blink of an eye, or a single moment could stretch into eternity. As they walked, Jason noticed something strange. The corridor ahead of them appeared to be different. At first, he couldn't place it, but as they drew closer, he realized what it was. The walls had changed. The once smooth surface now bore cracks, deep fissures that seemed to pulse with an unsettling light. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of something metallic, like blood or rust. And through the cracks, Jason could see fleeting images, glimpses of what appeared to be people, their faces twisted in agony, their mouths frozen in silent screams. "What's happening?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "This doesn't feel right. It feels like we're being watched." Tyler's face paled, and his steps faltered. "No, it's not just that we're being watched. It's like the whole place is alive, like it knows we're here, and it's changing because of us." He stopped walking, a horrified realization dawning on him. It's like we're not just in a building anymore. We're in a living, breathing thing, and it's reacting to us. Jason didn't want to believe it, but as he looked around, he couldn't deny the truth in Tyler's words. The walls weren't just static. They were shifting, pulsating with an almost conscious intent. It was as if they were being drawn deeper into a living nightmare, and the more they tried to escape, the more it adjusted to keep them trapped within its grasp. As they moved further down the hallway, the images behind the cracks in the walls grew more disturbing. Faces appeared, their eyes wide with terror, mouths agape in silent screams, as though begging for help, begging for release from whatever force held them captive in this place. But there was no help to be found. The figures seemed to merge and dissolve with each passing second, leaving only fragments of their existence behind. It was as if the very memories of those who had passed through this place were being absorbed into the walls, becoming part of the twisted fabric of whatever this place had become. "We need to get out of here," Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible, but the terror in her eyes was unmistakable. "I don't care what we have to do. We need to find a way out." Jason nodded, but deep down, he knew there was no simple escape. They were trapped in a reality that defied all logic, all reason. The more they walked, the more the place seemed to change around them, bending, shifting, as if it was trying to disorient them, to break their will. They had become part of this place now, and the place had become part of them. No matter how fast they ran, no matter how far they went, it would follow. There was no escape. The walls whispered, the air thickened, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to tremble with the pulse of something far older, far more powerful than they could understand. Jason glanced at his friends, their faces drawn with exhaustion, their eyes haunted by what they had seen. He could feel the weight of their collective dread pressing down on him, a suffocating pressure that threatened to crush him. The hallway stretched on forever, and with each step, the sense of being watched grew more intense, more palpable. They were not alone in this place. Something else was here, something that thrived in the dark corners of their minds, feeding off their fear. And as they pressed on, they realized with a sinking feeling that this was no longer about escaping a physical space. It was about escaping their own minds, and perhaps their very souls. As the group pressed on through the endless, winding corridors, the sense of urgency grew with each passing moment. Jason's mind raced with questions he couldn't answer. Was there a way out? Was this some twisted reality they had stumbled into? Or were they trapped in their own minds, held captive by something far more sinister? The walls around them seemed to press in, shifting and warping with every step. It was as if the very space they moved through was an organism, alive and aware, responding to their presence, manipulating their every move. Each breath Jason took felt heavy, laden with the oppressive weight of this place. And the walls, those same, unyielding walls, felt like they were closing in on him. Tyler, who had been oddly quiet for the past few minutes, broke the silence. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "It's like it's getting harder to breathe." Rachel turned to him, her face pale and drawn. "I know what you mean. It's suffocating. But it's not just the air. It's something in here with us. Something watching." Jason didn't reply, though he felt the same. There was a palpable presence in the air, something far more real than the oppressive atmosphere surrounding them. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and his pulse quickened. They weren't alone here, that much was certain. But whatever watched them was not human, and it had no intention of letting them go. Every corner they turned, every hall they passed, felt like another trap closing around them. There was no escape. As they walked, the corridor began to narrow, the one stretching space now feeling claustrophobic. The oppressive weight of the air became unbearable, thick with a stench that Jason couldn't quite identify. It was nauseating, and it made his stomach churn. The walls, which had once seemed so cold and indifferent, now pulsated with a sickly rhythm, like the heartbeat of some monstrous entity hidden just beyond the surface. He reached out to steady himself against the wall, but his fingers recoiled in disgust. The surface was slick and warm, like flesh. "I can't take this anymore," Rachel said suddenly, her voice breaking through the tension. I can't breathe. It's like the walls are closing in. We need to get out of here. Now." Her panic was contagious. Jason felt his own breath quicken, the sense of claustrophobia tightening around him. His mind raced as he struggled to push back the panic that threatened to consume him. But deep down, He knew that running wasn't going to help. They had been running from the same thing, only to find themselves trapped again and again. The walls, they were everywhere, shifting, rearranging, manipulating them. There was no escape. "Stay calm," Jason said, his voice hoarse, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to Rachel or to himself. "We need to stay together. We can't lose our heads now." But it was becoming increasingly difficult to remain calm. The walls seemed to be closing in, and the sound of their footsteps reverberated in a way that made it feel like they were walking in circles. Every turn led to another identical stretch of corridor. Every door they passed was locked or sealed, offering no way out. The sense of being trapped, not just in this place, but within their own minds, was suffocating. Jason's thoughts began to spiral, caught in an endless loop of fear and frustration. What was this place? Was it real? And more importantly, what had brought them here? Tyler suddenly stopped, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Jason froze, his heart pounding. The corridor had fallen eerily silent, and for the first time since they had entered, the oppressive weight of the air seemed to lift just slightly. But the silence was not a relief. It was a warning. "I don't hear anything," Rachel said, her voice strained, eyes darting around. Tyler's face had drained of color. "No, I heard it. A voice. It was calling my name." His voice faltered, as if he couldn't quite believe his own words. "It had sounded like my mother, but it wasn't her." Jason's heart skipped a beat. It was as if the walls themselves were trying to play with their minds, pulling them into deeper confusion, forcing them to question what was real and what was not. He turned to Tyler, trying to steady him, but before he could speak, another sound echoed through the corridor, a low, drawn-out moan that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. It was unnatural, an impossible sound that twisted something deep inside Jason, a primal fear that made his skin crawl. Rachel jumped, clutching at Jason's arm. What the hell was that? Jason's mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. The moaning sound reverberated again, followed by the soft, rhythmic tap of footsteps that weren't their own. And then, just as suddenly, everything fell silent again. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. "We need to get out," Jason said, his voice trembling, but there was no denying the growing sense of terror that gripped him. Whatever was here, whatever had made that noise, was no longer content to remain hidden. It was drawing closer, and there was no way to outrun it. They turned to move forward, but the corridor stretched on in front of them, an endless maze that seemed to mock their every step. The walls closed in tighter, the air thickening with each breath. Jason felt the panic rise in his chest, suffocating him, but he couldn't stop moving. There was nothing left to do but keep going, even though every instinct screamed at him to turn around and run. Then, as they rounded another corner, the impossible happened. The corridor that had been so narrow suddenly opened up, and they found themselves standing in a vast, empty space. A cavernous room, its size unfathomable, stretched out before them. And in the center of the room stood a figure, cloaked in shadow, its form indistinct and shifting, like it was both part of the darkness and separate from it. Jason froze, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even something human. It was something older, something darker, something that had been waiting for them. The figure raised its head, and Jason felt the weight of its gaze settle on him like a physical presence, suffocating in its intensity. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said, its voice a low, guttural rasp that sent chills through Jason's spine. "Now you'll never leave." The figure in the center of the cavernous room loomed over them, its presence overwhelming, as if it was both part of the shadows and something beyond them. Jason's heart pounded in his chest, and the walls, now seemingly distant, felt as though they had been absorbed into the very air around them. It was a space that defied logic, an expanse of nothingness that swallowed the light from their torches and reflected back a sense of deep, unsettling emptiness. As the figure's voice echoed in the chamber, Jason felt the floor beneath his feet tremble slightly, as if the very foundation of this place was alive. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure said again, its voice a cruel whisper that resonated in the pit of Jason's stomach. "Now you'll never leave." The words hung in the air like a cold, suffocating fog, and Jason could feel the weight of them pressing down on him, strangling his thoughts. He wanted to respond, wanted to tell the figure that they had no choice, that they had been forced into this nightmare, but the words wouldn't come. Fear had a grip on him now, a hold so tight that it felt like his very bones were shaking in protest. His mind screamed for him to run, to escape, but the impossibility of that thought paralyzed him. Tyler, who had been standing frozen next to Jason, suddenly jerked forward, his face contorted in an expression of intense pain. It was as if the figure's words had physically struck him. He gasped for air, his hand clutching his chest as if trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. "What's happening to me?" he choked out, his voice breaking. "I can't breathe." Jason grabbed Tyler's arm, pulling him back, but it was as if there was an invisible force keeping him locked in place. The pressure in the air thickened, growing heavier by the second, and Jason felt it too now, the stifling weight of whatever force was controlling this place, pulling them further into its grasp. The room seemed to shift around them, stretching and contracting like the beating of a monstrous heart. The shadows on the walls seemed to flicker and pulse with a life of their own, drawing closer and closer to the group, as though they were being swallowed by the very darkness they had come to fear. Rachel, her face ashen and eyes wide with panic, moved closer to Jason. "We need to get out of here," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible over the overwhelming silence that had descended upon them. "We can't let it control us. We have to find a way out." But Jason knew, deep down, that there was no escaping this place. Not anymore. Not with the figure standing before them, its eyes hidden in the shadow, but still somehow visible, still somehow knowing. It had been waiting for them, drawing them in with each step, each twist of the corridor. They were trapped, and there was no way out. Suddenly, the figure moved. It didn't walk. It simply shifted, gliding through the air as though it wasn't bound by the laws of physics. It came closer to them, its form undulating, constantly shifting between shadow and substance. Jason's stomach churned as it neared, the air growing colder, the oppressive silence pressing against his ears. And then, just as suddenly, the figure stopped. The pressure in the room dissipated slightly, but Jason knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Something far darker was at play here, something he couldn't yet understand, but could feel in every fiber of his being. He wanted to scream, wanted to run, but there was nothing to hold on to, nothing that felt real anymore. The walls had been alive, the air had been alive, everything had been alive, and this figure before him, whatever it was at the center of it all. "You think you can leave?" The figure spoke again, its voice sharp and mocking now. "But there is no escape. Not from me. Not from this place." Jason could feel Tyler's grip tightening on his arm, and he turned to see his friend's face contorted in agony, his eyes wide with terror. Tyler opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Only a sound, a hollow, gurgling noise, as though something was trying to force its way out of him. Jason stepped back instinctively, fear surging through him as he watched his friend struggle. It was like watching someone drown in slow motion, unable to breathe, unable to escape the invisible force that was tearing him apart. "Tyler!" Jason shouted, reaching out for him, but it was as if the air itself was pushing him back. He couldn't get close. The figure, still motionless, seemed to be feeding off their fear, its form growing darker with each passing second, each desperate breath they took. The room felt colder now, the edges of their vision blurring as if reality itself was cracking apart. Jason's mind raced as the sound of Tyler's struggling grew louder, the frantic gasps for air mixing with the eerie silence. He had to do something, anything. He looked around the room, desperate for a way out, but the walls had become indistinguishable from the shadows themselves. There was no door, no window, no escape. There was only the figure, standing motionless, and Tyler, who was slowly being consumed by whatever dark force was at work here. And then, in a split second, everything changed. Tyler stopped gasping. The room fell into an unnatural silence, and for a moment, Jason dared to hope. But that hope was short-lived. Tyler's body twitched violently, and his eyes snapped open, but they were no longer his eyes. The familiar warmth and life that had once been there were replaced by an empty, hollow void. His pupils were black, his expression blank, and his body now stood perfectly still, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled tight. Rachel screamed. Jason turned to look at her, his mind reeling, but when he looked back at Tyler, there was something wrong, terribly wrong. Tyler's mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, a deep, guttural growl emerged, vibrating through the air like a low, menacing hum. The figure in the center of the room stirred, as though pleased, as if this was exactly what it had wanted. Jason's heart sank. This was not his friend anymore. This was something else, something more than human, something that had been unleashed in the very heart of this nightmare. The fractures had begun, and there was no going back. The figure had won. The world around them seemed to shift once again, as though the very fabric of reality was unspooling, thread by thread. Jason's breath came in ragged gasps, his heart racing as he watched Tyler, no, not Tyler, stand motionless before them. The figure in the center of the room, that shadowy entity that had been pulling at the seams of their minds, was not just an observer anymore. It was a puppeteer controlling the strings of fate, pulling each of them deeper into its web of terror. Jason didn't know how to move. His legs felt like stone, his body frozen in a state of paralysis. Rachel's face was pale, her eyes wide with shock, but her lips trembled as she whispered, This isn't real. It can't be." Her words felt empty in the vast, oppressive silence that had swallowed them whole. But Jason knew it was real, too real. The figure standing before them, its presence so immense and suffocating, was not something they could outrun. It wasn't merely a creature, a monster, or an apparition. It was an all-consuming force, a manifestation of something far darker than they could comprehend. It was as if the very concept of fear and despair had been given form, and it had them in its grasp. The thing that had once been Tyler didn't speak, didn't move, but its eyes, those empty black eyes, locked onto Jason, sending a jolt of pure terror through his veins. There was no recognition, no humanity left in them, just the cold void of something ancient and hungry. Jason wanted to scream, wanted to run, but the room itself seemed to have folded in on them, trapping them in a space where the walls were no longer solid, but fluid, shifting, bending. The figure lifted its hand slowly, its fingers elongating, like dark tendrils reaching toward them. Jason instinctively stepped back, dragging Rachel with him, but it was as if the space itself conspired against them. The air was thick with an unseen weight, and every step they tried to take felt like they were wading through thick, molasses-like fog. "Leave," the figure's voice echoed, a sharp, piercing whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. Its tone was low, an oppressive murmur that reverberated in Jason's chest, shaking him to his core. It wasn't a command. No, it was a promise, a threat wrapped in the guise of an instruction. "You do not belong here." Rachel squeezed Jason's arm, her face pale and frantic. "What does it want?" she gasped, her voice trembling. Jason didn't have an answer. He wished he did, but nothing made sense anymore. He had no way of knowing how they had gotten here, and now, he wasn't even sure how they could leave, if they even could. The moment stretched, pulling them deeper into a darkness that was more than physical. It was as if their very thoughts were being drawn into the black abyss, swallowed whole by the impossible force that loomed before them. Jason's chest tightened, and he felt himself being pulled toward it, as though some invisible hand was dragging him closer, forcing him to confront whatever horrors lay at its center. "Tyler," Jason whispered, his voice cracking. "Tyler, if you're in there, if you can hear me, please come back." He reached out, his hand trembling, but Tyler, or whatever had replaced him, did not respond. Instead, it moved. Tyler's body jerked violently, a shudder running through it like a wave crashing against a jagged cliff. The guttural growl emerged once more, louder this time, almost deafening in its intensity. The black eyes blinked, but there was no recognition there, no flicker of humanity, only an endless, swirling void that stretched out into infinity. Tyler's mouth twisted into something resembling a smile, though it was far from human. And then, without warning, it spoke. "I never was Tyler," it said, the words slithering from its throat like liquid poison. "Not anymore." Jason's heart stopped, and Rachel let out a strangled sob. The air seemed to crackle, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Jason's breath began to fog in front of him. It wasn't just a figure, it was everything around them, everything that they had thought they understood about reality beginning to break apart. "He's gone." The thing continued, its voice now a chorus of hundreds of other voices, all speaking at once, layered over one another in a maddening cacophony. "This place it takes, it feeds, and now it will take you too." The walls around them began to twist and warp, as though they were alive, pulsating with an unsettling rhythm. Jason could feel the very air around them changing, its pressure building to unbearable levels. He thought he could hear faint whispers, distant voices that seemed to be calling from the depths of the earth. He wanted to shout, to do something, anything, to break free from this nightmare. But the darkness was closing in, suffocating him, erasing all traces of his own thoughts. Rachel turned to him, panic in her eyes. "We have to do something. We can't just let it." Her words were cut off as she gasped, her body shuddering violently as if struck by an unseen force. She crumpled to the ground, her face twisted in pain, but Jason couldn't reach her. He was too far away, as though an invisible barrier now separated them. He could only watch as she fell, unable to help her. And that was when he understood. This wasn't just a place of terror. This wasn't just a haunted space or a twisted manifestation of fear. This was something far older, something far more dangerous. The figure, Tyler, Rachel, they were all being consumed by it. It wasn't just pulling them into the darkness. It was feeding off them, drawing their very essence into itself. "You are nothing here," the thing whispered. "I am everything." And in that moment, Jason realized there was no escape. There had never been one. This was the end, the unraveling of everything, the tearing apart of what they had once known. They were caught in the maw of something ancient and powerful, something that fed on fear, on despair, on the broken remnants of hope. It was too late to fight back. All that was left was to fall. And fall they did. The room cracked open beneath them, and everyone was swallowed whole. The world had gone eerily silent. The last remnants of light seemed to dissipate, swallowed by the endless void that surrounded them. Jason's mind buzzed, disoriented, as he tried to grasp onto the fragments of what had happened. The room, once oppressive and dark, had collapsed into nothingness. There were no walls, no ceilings, no solid ground beneath his feet. Only an infinite, black emptiness. But despite the void, despite the suffocating absence of everything they had known, Jason could still feel the presence. It was a weight pressing down on him from all directions, suffocating him. The thing that had taken Tyler, that had consumed Rachel, was still there, lingering in the corners of his mind. He could hear it, a distant echo, a whisper in the darkness. It was speaking to him, or was it just in his head? He couldn't be sure anymore. His senses, his perception of time and space, had fractured in ways he couldn't comprehend. Was he still on the bus? Was he even alive anymore? These questions swirled in his mind, unanswered in the way that everything now seemed so empty, so broken. It had been so much easier before. They had been on a tour bus, heading to a place that was supposed to be an adventure, an escape. There had been the hum of conversation, the clink of coffee cups, the soft rattle of the road beneath them. That had been the world Jason knew, the world he understood. But it was gone now. And what remained, this was incomprehensible. He wanted to scream, to claw his way out of the nothingness, but there was nothing to grasp, nothing to fight against. He thought about Rachel, about how she had collapsed, her body trembling as the darkness closed in. Had she made it out? Or had she, like Tyler, become a part of the thing that had pulled them into this nightmare? He couldn't remember. The more he tried to focus, the more the memories blurred, slipping through his fingers like sand. It was as if time had lost all meaning, as if the very concept of past and future had been erased. His thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible whisper. It wasn't a voice he recognized. It wasn't Rachel or Tyler or even that dreadful entity. It was something else entirely. Jason strained to listen, but all he could make out were fragments, words that danced just out of reach. Empty, nothing, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent, and then a flicker, a sudden, piercing light that ripped through the darkness, blinding him. Jason squinted, his heart racing, but the light faded as quickly as it had appeared, and in its place came a sound, the sound of the road. The hum of the tires on asphalt, the gentle clink of the bus's overhead lights. Was it a dream? Had everything that had happened only been in his mind? He opened his eyes fully, and the scene before him slowly came into focus. The bus. The familiar, dimly lit interior. The seats were all in place. The windows were intact, and the road stretched out ahead of them, endless. He blinked, unsure of what he was seeing. Was he awake? Was this the real world? Or had he simply traded one nightmare for another? His heart sank as his gaze fell upon the passengers. Rachel, still unconscious, sat motionless in her seat. Tyler, or what was left of him, was slumped against the window, his face a twisted mask of horror. The other passengers, the ones who had been with them on the journey, were also silent, their faces blank, lifeless. Jason's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. They hadn't escaped. They hadn't broken free. The entity had not only taken their memories, their hopes, and their lives, it had left them in this limbo, trapped in an endless cycle of false beginnings. They were still on the bus, still heading toward a destination that would never come. Was this their punishment? Were they doomed to live out this journey forever? Forever repeating the same loop, trapped in the horrors of their own minds? Jason tried to stand, to move toward the door, but his body felt heavy, as though it were made of lead. He couldn't escape it. There was no way out. And then, in the distance, a shadow moved, an outline in the farthest corner of his vision. Jason turned his head, his pulse quickening as he stared into the growing darkness beyond the bus. It was a figure, familiar yet twisted. It was himself, or at least a reflection of him. It was the face of the man who had once been on the tour, but now distorted, pulled taut with the weight of his own fears. A grotesque mirror image. There's nowhere left to run, the figure said, its voice low and gravelly. Asterisk, you've already lost. The words were not an accusation, but a statement of fact. Jason understood, finally, that he had never truly been free. This was not a story with an end, not a journey that could be completed. It had always been an illusion, a trick, a trap. They had been consumed by something much larger than themselves, something that fed on their fear, their confusion. Jason looked around at the other passengers, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. They were all trapped, all victims of the same fate. And for the first time, Jason felt the crushing weight of despair. There was no escape. There was no end. The bus continued down the endless road, its tires humming, its lights flickering in the dark. The figure, his own distorted reflection, disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the echo of its words. And in that moment, Jason realized that there was no light, no salvation, no way to break free. There was only the road ahead, forever.